welcome to another conversation. And today I'm joined by Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who has written an extraordinary book called How to Talk About Climate Change and Make a Difference. So welcome, Rebecca, and perhaps you would tell people a little bit about your background, because it's quite extraordinary.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on. My background is eclectic, I suppose, is probably the one way of describing it. But actually, it's actually quite typical of people who go into social research. They find slightly different ways to get into it. So I did an honours degree in film and a law degree. My father was a lawyer. In fact, my great grandmother was one of the first women to get a law degree in South Australia. So I come from a long line of lawyers on my father's side, and a long line of labourers and gardeners from my mother's side, because she's Italian, so from migrants basically. So very diverse background, lawyer, and I thought I would either be a lawyer or be an academic. I did a PhD, but even when I was finishing my PhD 20 years ago, the university sector looked like it was changing very quickly, and it didn't look like there was an enormous amount of job security. And of course, it's changed even more now. So I had a kind of serendipitous meeting with a very famous social researcher and writer, Hugh Mackay, who kind of took me under his wing and encouraged me to go into social research, which is an industry that I hadn't even really been aware. I knew about market research, about people who interrupted your dinner asking you about toilet paper, but I didn't realise that a lot of the skills that I developed as an academic, so listening, writing, analysing, researching, writing, putting it together in a kind of cogent argument, was something that actually could be done in the commercial world. So that's when I went to Ipsos and ran something called the Mind and Mood Report, which I ran for nearly 10 years. So that was I stumbled into social research reeling out of academia, and have never looked back.
Wow. So what made you look at climate change? You know, what sort of moment made you think, I really want to focus on this?
Well, it was both professional and personal. You know, in the 15 or so years that I was at Ipsos and some other research firms, kind of looking at big, broad, important economic and social issues that worry Australians, the environment and climate change would come up. And so I'd look at it, it'd be one of a whole lot of issues that I'd be exploring. So I had a kind of intellectual interest in it, typical for a woman of my age, where I live and my background. I believed that climate change was a thing and a problem and something that governments needed to address, but I very much approached it from an academic point of view. I saw that more and more Australians were saying in surveys that they were concerned, but it wasn't necessarily translating into action. We weren't necessarily voting for political parties that put climate change at front and centre in their policy decision making. And so, you know, with the last federal election, when I was, like a lot of people in my industry, kind of convinced that the Labor Party would win and that that their climate policies weren't going to be a problem, when that didn't happen, I thought, well, I think we need to have probably some more precise tools to really understand why people feel the way they do about climate change. And this is becoming a communications issue to the public, rather than previously being primarily a technological issue. So we've got the tools mainly to deal with climate change, but we don't necessarily have the level of community consensus that we need. So it seemed like, I mean, in some ways, climate change as a research and communications problem is the Mount Everest of problems. Like it's such a, people call it a wicked problem. So it was feeling like, okay, we've really got to find a way to crack this as best as we can. So there was a professional urgency to it and a kind of a challenge, but there was also a personal moment as the mother of 3 children to think, well, a lot of the science that I was reading was saying we have kind of 10 years to really do 2 dramatic things: to transition as quickly as we can to away from fossil fuels to a low carbon economy. And we've also got to take all of the CO2 that's already in the system out, so what's often called drawdown. So we've got to do 2 of those things quite quickly, and we can do it if we all put our minds to it, or we're looking at like tracking to over 2%. And the consensus, and I don't mean 70 or 80%, I'm saying over 95% of scientists, research scientists, climate scientists say this is an area we don't want to be for a whole range of reasons. And for me, 10 years, my twins are 6. I have 2 twin girls and a 12-year-old. My twins won't have even finished high school when we have to start to, when I thought about that deadline. And so I really started to think, you know, finding a way to focus my professional and personal interests, my professional and personal skills and energy with everybody who's trying to do something around climate is part and parcel for me of ensuring that my children grow up in a livable world. I want them to have good teeth, a good education, kind hearts, and live in a world where they aren't fearful of summer, and where they don't go to the beach and see the shoreline eroding, where they will be able to see a koala in the wild. Those are the kinds of things I really want for them, and that's why that was a very personal commitment to trying to be part of the climate solution in Australia.
You've actually been quite mercenary about it, who you work for, what conversations you will have. For somebody that's a social researcher, you know a lot about a lot of different subjects, and you just said, that's it.
I think, and look, for a while I thought one of the things that's really clear when you talk to people about climate change is actually you're talking to them about a whole range of other things. If you're in the Hunter Valley and you're talking to people about climate change, you're really talking to them about how they feel about the industries that have built their community up and whether they hope there'll be jobs in the future. So understanding how people feel about employment, about job security is really important in terms of understanding climate change. For somebody else in another part of Australia, talking about climate change might be about how they feel about the national parks and the wildlife around them. If they're a farmer, a farming community, they want to be able to preserve it, but also they want to be able to use their land in the best way that they can. Farming in the climate age is not fun. So when you're talking to them about climate change, you're also talking to them about how they feel about their own land, about how they feel about their grandfather and grandmother that farmed that land, about how they feel about whether their children will ever take on that role. So you're talking about all of that other anxiety, concern about change, particularly in regional Australia. So what's clear is when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about a whole range of other things on top of it. So helping understand how people feel about our society, about change, about our economy, where they sit in it, their level of anxiety or concern, their sense of agency, all of that comes into play when you're talking about climate change.
That's a really interesting point, because I'm noticing a whole lot of communities or stakeholders suddenly waking up and feeling as though they can have part of the discussion, like the healthcare profession, for example.
Exactly.
You know, this is our part, and this is what we can do, and this is what we stand for. Has that been a long, slow education process, or do you?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Very, very insightful. Look, I think that there has been a push and a pull there in that area. The healthcare professionals are really interesting, you know. So in Australia, we've had some really strong statements come from the Australian Medical Association, so the peak body for doctors, from nurses and midwives. Ambulance Victoria have made some really strong commitments after the fires to becoming a kind of carbon neutral service and declaring a climate emergency. And a lot of those healthcare professionals are saying the climate change is a healthcare emergency, right? So not just in terms of what it means for the system when we have to deal with crisis, whether that crisis be a natural crisis, or what we forget is actually in heat waves, significant heat waves, more people die in kind of heat waves than do in kind of sudden bushfires or all the rest of it. So they kind of see that pressure being put on the healthcare system, as well as the mental health system, which already needs a lot of work. So they see that. What's been interesting is I think for a lot of those professions, it has been a bit of a slow drip, and there's been some, you know, different leadership globally from the WHO, But also I think some of the clever people in the climate movement have recognised that not everybody is going to listen to the environment movement on climate for a whole range of reasons. They can't be the only spokesperson. So they have worked quite strategically with the healthcare professions, even industries like the insurance industry, talking about the idea that not addressing climate change is a financial risk, and it's starting to become like, I mean, it's not just a financial risk in 20 or 30 years time, literally becoming a financial risk now. So, so that's really useful. And I think it's really important. I understand why a lot of people don't necessarily engage with the environment movement. I hadn't really engaged with it much since quite recently. I never saw myself as a greenie. I always thought I looked terrible in Birkenstocks. I really, like, I don't want to camp. I don't want to do any of those things. And it's not that I didn't love nature. It's just I just didn't culturally and personally identify with the environment movement. So we do need different people speaking out. And I think some of the most effective spokespeople around climate change after the fires were first responders, the firefighters, the people in the ambulance services, the people actually dealing with things like smoke inhalation and dealing with the consequences of smoke inhalation with women who are pregnant. So yeah, so you're absolutely right. That's been a bit of a slow drip, and it's been, you know, leadership within the healthcare services, but also I think a very smart thing that the climate movement has done, which is we need powerful allies across the community who are able to speak about this in a way that the environment movement can't.
Yeah. How do you think we restart the discussion? And that's probably a bad word for somebody who works in that area solely, but we had the fires and we could see it, we could feel it, we could smell it. Every Australian was ready to go on climate change, you know, just, you know, we were all so focused on it. And then, of course, COVID happened.
Yeah.
And now we're going back to basics, that we have to, you know, re-energize people. What's it going to take?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there is a bit of a needing to refocus, but when COVID hit, I thought I was very, very despondent. I thought, okay, we're going to lose a year and a half that we don't have while everybody is dealing with this crisis. And I also was really concerned that what would happen is we'd see a slight drop in emissions, not a particularly big one, but a slight drop because people weren't driving or flying, and all of that stuff would happen. And people would associate improvements in the environment and climate change with deprivation, with this idea that with crisis, with economic downturn, with unhappiness, with having to homeschool your children, like having to, all of those kinds of things. So I thought there would be a really negative association. And while there does need to be a refocusing, what happened last year was something I could never have expected, which is that we had very big organisations, big banks, big superannuation companies, big retailers like Woolworths and IKEA. We had an enormous amount of commitment from the finance sector and also from the broader business community to continuing to do quite significant things on climate. We had an announcement from both South Korea and Japan, who interestingly are two of our biggest export markets, probably more than China, for things like coal and gas, to say things that they were, to actually make some really significant commitments to going away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. We had Twiggy Forrest come out and talk about hydrogen. And while all of that was happening, we also had really strong statements from the Australian Institute of Company Directors, from the National Farmers Federation. We had quite extraordinary things happening in Australia and globally, topped off by the fact that Joe Biden won the election pretty convincingly, as some people would say, and made climate policy not only front and centre of the rhetoric, but also what he's managed to do in the first week, you know, however many days that he's been around. So I thought, what this shows people is that, of course, COVID and the health of our community is a priority and will continue to be, and we're still not out of the woods. but smart people, committed people can walk and chew gum at the same time and recognise that when we emerge out of this, you know, fully vaccinated, you know, chastened and changed, but when we move out of this, we still have climate change to address. And so that actually made me feel quite buoyed. And then at the same time, in all the research I was doing last year in various communities, while everybody was saying COVID is the priority, you would say, well, what else? Can we do anything else at the same time as doing COVID? And said, well, if it helps our economic recovery, create jobs and strengthen the economy, absolutely. So the argument was there to be made that continuing investment in renewable energy was complementary with building back after COVID, which is why you saw Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria make astronomical and exciting commitments to renewable energy in their budgets of last year. So we're seeing action at the state level in Australia that we've probably never seen up until last year. So that was a real cause of optimism. Last year, weirdly, I mean, I'm lucky too because nobody I know has died of COVID. Very few people I know have lost their job. So I'm kind of in a privileged position. But I kept saying, first of all, that Australia has dealt with it pretty well. And we've got off pretty lightly compared to other countries. And we've also seen action on another great challenge and great opportunity that faces us, which I hope will help us build back out of COVID better than we were before.
Well, we've certainly experienced how to mobilise in a crisis, haven't we?
Exactly.
You know, everyone's a crisis expert now. We know what's got to be done.
That's right.
So really, climate change, which for many people has been a little daunting, like where do I start?
Yes, exactly.
It's you know, we just need the steps now, which sort of leads to your book. What made you write about emotions, which is, you know, in climate change? My background originally was PR and marketing before I ran Flash. And you know, everything we do is about behaviour change. Yeah. And you've fundamentally written the rule book for behaviour change and what people need to do, because the science has been so dominant.
Yes.
But people's eyes can glaze over with facts, you know, being muffed at them all the time.
No, that's right. And that doesn't mean that they don't respect the facts. It's just there's only so many facts that we can absorb. And we need a link between the facts and the so what for us. Well, what does this actually mean for me, and how might this change or improve my life and the life of the people around me and my community in a material way in the horizon that I deal with, which is most people. And I've done this, you know, years and years of researching people. For most people, they're just trying to get through the next week, month, couple of years. They have kind of hazy ideas about where they might want to be in the future. But when you start saying 2050, 2030, 2040, and, you know, temperature rises, that doesn't really gel with them. Why did I write a book on emotion? Well, I mean, and I say it a lot in the book, I never did psychology at university. I did I did lots of theoretical, esoteric subjects. I did law, and law was about reason. Law was about, and probably also slightly delusional, the idea that, you know, the person with the best argument won. The person with the greatest understanding of the facts and the most structured and rigorous way to present it won. And if you were being emotional, unless you had a jury, if you were being an emotional, that motion was stripped out. Emotion made you kind of irrational, and lawyers are highly rational. So it was a little bit about my training, and a PhD is a bit like that as well. So but, you know, 15 years of listening to Australians talk about what they think and feel made me understand that emotion is really important, and not just your own emotional sense of something, what the people around you feel, you know, that kind of group emotion, that kind of herd instinct was really important. So I understood that was always going to be more persuasive than a reflective, you know, a kind of reflective individual thoughts. But what I hadn't really quite looked at is all of all these various emotions individually within the context of climate change. And I felt like I really needed to understand that. And I also needed to understand the limits of reason and effective ways to use emotion. Because there's a bit of a furphy in, as you would know, as a comms and PR and marketing expert, there's a bit of a furphy that there's always the things about, oh, you know, you've always got to be positive, you know, you can't be negative, can't always be negative. But then people would say negativity works, it cuts through. And of course, the reality is somewhere between the two. You can't, we're not going to convince people by being, you know, Pollyanna-ish and overly optimistic about what it's going to take to deal with climate change. But we're not going to be effective either if we continuously paint these apocalyptic visions of the world and the future. People are going to, they're not going to believe it, and they're not going to want to absorb it. So I realised that in the increasingly diverse and the building up of the kind of increasingly interesting and growing area of understanding the interconnection between psychology and politics and how that works at an individual level and a community level, there'd be some real insights there around climate change. So for me, it was almost like psychology 101. I went into lots of kind of basic, you know, academic reading around these different emotions, and then looked at how that was being employed by people looking at climate change, and then looking at how activists, so people around the world who are trying to do something about climate change, how they employ these emotions, and also how they manage those emotions internally for themselves. Because as I was writing the book, I wrote it, I researched it for a long time, wrote bits of it, but wrote most of it in kind of a sprint over the Black Summer fires with no air conditioning. So it was itself a real experience of writing this book and then constantly being on social media, you know, writing a chapter on denial and then watching social media saying, oh, the fires aren't, this isn't, you know, the fires aren't that bad, or it's got nothing to do with climate change, but it's all arsonists causing the fires. And you're just like, so it was a very interesting experience. And I've got to say, I went through all the emotions that I wrote about in the book in that 5 weeks, I've got to say.
So is there one emotion that you think is the most powerful of all the emotions to understand and harness people around climate change?
Look, this wasn't the chapter that really that stuck out for most people, but it was the most important one for me to write, and that's this notion of loss. So one of the things that you realise is that often for people to engage deeply with climate change requires, there's some things that you lose, and you're asking people to lose some things, and that is a really huge thing. One of the sense of loss that I had was of this notion of a kind of a limitless future for my children and grandchildren, and I thought, well, maybe that might be taken away. Maybe my children will grow up and not want to have children of their own because of climate change. We're seeing that a little bit already, young Australians questioning whether they want to bring children into a world with climate change. That upsets me as an Italian who loves children and has 3 and would have had more. So that was really difficult. A loss of identity, and you see that all the time when you ask people. Climate change is so much, and it's been a real problem, so much being positioned as something that of the progressive left, right? Yeah. Something only the progressive left care about, and that's a problem. And you know, that's a real problem, because climate change affects us all. So if you're asking somebody who is a conservative, or somebody who wouldn't necessarily identify with the progressive left to engage with climate change in a way that says they have to rethink all other things in their life, that doesn't work either. But conservatives are doing that all around the world, and they should be congratulated for it, and they should be supported. Climate change should be the broadest possible, as a movement, the broadest possible church. But I suppose the other thing that was really interesting about that loss chapter, and I thought about it particularly in terms of the fires, because one of the, you know, I didn't lose any loved ones, I certainly didn't lose any property, but a place that I had gone to with my children and with the family that we're very close to only a couple of months previously, where we'd seen wombats and we'd had a wonderful time, just burnt to the ground. And I felt this kind of, I felt this kind of extraordinary sense of loss for those lovely people who owned that house. But also we had planned to go back there, and I thought, we do need to tap into the things that people love and value, and understanding that some of those things are under threat. And then out of that, very quickly mobilise confidence and optimism that we have the tools, both the technology and the social tools. As you rightly said, we know how to mobilise in a crisis to protect further loss, whether that be koalas, whether that be places that we love, whether that be a summer where we can play cricket with our kids without having to play it at 7 a.m. in the morning or 7 p.m. at night. That sense of loss, which isn't an overwhelming sense of despair, that sense of loss of what's at stake is absolutely central. And I think, having talked to, for example, 4th or 5th generation farmers who've engaged with climate change, the thing that's made them engage with it is that I want somebody to keep farming this land that's been farmed by my family for 100 years. So in order to keep what I want to keep, I have to change. In order not to lose anything else, I need to adapt, and I need to address what's in front of me. And so that chapter on loss, it's not the one that stands out. Everybody loves the one on denial and anger and all the rest of it. For me, loss is a really interesting way into the conversation. And it was one of the more interesting people that I interviewed for the book, Reverend Jim Antal, talked to me about the role that religions can play in helping people find a positive and constructive way through loss and grief, and how that can be something that isn't just something that you fall into yourself with, but do with the community around you.
It's really interesting. Grief and loss, we do a lot in, and it's the one constant for all of us in life. We all go through grief and loss, whether it's loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of a home, finances, everything. So to put it into that construct on the table means that we have to start thinking about our whole lives a lot more. And that's really important.
That's exactly right. So while all of the emotions in the book can be constructive, the only one I'm still a bit iffy about, I don't think shame ever works. I don't think shaming people into action works. I think you don't shame coal miners into stopping being coal miners. You don't make them feel ashamed of their job or ashamed of their industry. So I'm not a big fan of shame, but everything else used well and constructively and thoughtfully, anything that leads to optimism and action as a final as a kind of endpoint, is useful. But some of these emotions can definitely backfire. Even hope, which is based on this idea that something will happen, somebody else will fix it. That's not so much hope as that is kind of delusion.
Yeah. So we've had, a climate strike, action, our use of the world, just extraordinary. Why do you think females, gender, has been so slow to lead the charge? Because we're the natural nurturers, and you would think we would, we're talking about children and our grandchildren, you'd think we'd be ahead of everyone else.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So that in the research that I do, women, while the differences in attitudes to climate change are generally driven by education, age, and to some extent where you live, like your social network around you, and we don't want to make too many generalisations about that. There are some skews in terms of gender. So women are just generally a bit more focused on concern about the environment and climate change than men are. But again, I don't want to generalise about it too much. But women have always been, you know, even though women were at the forefront of the anti-nuclear campaigns. They've played critical roles in the environment movement, not always as the obvious leaders, but as being there in the kind of grassroots. What's kind of interesting about young women in particular, and there've been a lot of young women from around the world in lots of different countries that have been, including in Australia, some extraordinary young women who not only ran the strikes here, but also in the Indigenous community, a lot of amazing young women talking about climate change. I think there's a particular combination, and there's been even some research that I talk about in the book about it, of how networked these young women are, how great they are at just getting other people to do things, and how articulate they are. And the other two things that I think are different now, I think that's probably always been a bit the case about young women. The other two things about them, first of all, engagement with science, with STEM. There's been a an effort in education to address that gender gap, and now that's happening. So in research that I've done with young women, when we've asked them what career they'd like to go into the future, something like 25%, 30% consider STEM subjects, in a way that just never have been the case. So we're starting to see greater engagement and interest in science, and greater engagement and interest in politics. So there's been a social and educational change on top of the usual ability of girls being just generally, for whatever reason, better verbally and better at just kind of mobilising the herd to do things. So I think it's one of the many reasons why they are where they are. And so I interview a couple of them in the book, some young women activists that were part of the climate strike. And that's what struck me about them.
Okay. So what does bird watching have to do with climate change?
Oh, this is I've got to say, is one of my favourite examples. I didn't want the book to be just kind of even well written or easily accessible social research. So I just wanted lots of little case studies of people and communication strategies that were effective. And when I was at Yale, spending some time with the people who run the climate program over there, a whole lot of social scientists, I met a woman who had been kind of campaigns manager for a 100-year-old heritage environmental organisation called the Audubon Society, bird watchers, basically. And she had got the okay from her board to do some work with bird watchers around climate change, which was a bit of a departure, because normally they'd been about protection of habitat. They'd been environmentalists that way, but climate change has always been such a politicised area that they'd kept away from it. So yes, let's protect these woods so the eastern blue-crested warbler can nest there, but they wouldn't necessarily deal with fossil fuel companies and all the rest of it. But she felt that obviously all these things are connected as they are in nature. So she did a bit of research with bird watchers, who tend to be, unsurprisingly, older, from across the political spectrum, but we know, because they love birds, that the thing they love is centred in nature, and they're also really intuitive about nature, right? They're seeing the seasons change, they're seeing that effect on birds, and they're recognising that if it continues that way over time, that the thing that they love will be under threat. And so she did some work with them to understand what they didn't like about the way that the traditional climate movement communicated with them. She worked with them to think about, well, what is it how do we need to flip the script? How do we need to make it more persuasive? She realised that if you start with birds, if you start the thing that you love, and then you find a way to say, this is the thing you love, the activity that you love is being challenged by the changing environment. This is one of the things causing a change in environment, and these are the things you can do. And actually managed to activate these bird watchers quite effectively, starting with the thing that they valued. And it's a very small example of it's a small case study of what I know to be true, which is that the traditional climate script, which starts with the scientific data, and then says, this is what this is a chart, and look at all these red arrows and all the rest of it, and this is an ICPPC report, and this is what Al Gore said. Oh, and by the way, you've got to do all these things. It's so disconnected from our lives. You've got to start with the thing that community or that group value and ladder up, and then give them a sense of how can you play a role in this, which isn't about shaving your hair off and joining Extinction Rebellion, or if that's what you want to do. I'd make no judgment, but most people don't want to do that. Most people want to live the life they're living and find a way within that context to act to protect the thing they loved. So what she managed to do with these bird watchers as well is she wasn't asking them to join Greenpeace. She was saying, you're already going to bird watching meetings. How can you take the networks, the activism, the knowledge you already have and direct it at a campaign to address climate change in your local area? And that's what she managed to do. So lots of learnings there about how we can communicate and activate people on climate change.
So that's an excellent segue probably to the last question in this section is so recognising it's a continuum, because people's skills and understanding are at different levels.
Yes.
Where does someone start? You know, they've heard all the science, they were motivated after the fires, but somehow they got focused on COVID, and their kids are talking about it at home, but they're really doing not much. Where do they start?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I always say start from where you are. So I would say the first thing I'd say, other than the other things that we can, there's a few little things we can do. We can offset our flights and cars and, you know, change our superannuation and do some of those things, which are actually not big things to do and not actually that expensive. So, but one of the things I always think about is that you're already powerful in the life that you have. So who do you talk to? What community organisations do you belong to? What do you do for a job? And I'm going to give you two examples. I'm at the moment doing a big piece of research on the work that on an organisation called RE100, which is an organisation of huge businesses signed up to it. Unilever, IKEA, all the big banks, Macquarie Bank, all of these big multinational Australian-based corporations that have committed to 100% renewable energy in their buildings and supply chains, some of them by 2025 and some by 2030, depending. When you talk to those organisations and you ask, why have you made this commitment? And some of them also made significant commitments to sustainability and climate change. They say two things. They say our investors, their money is moving, right? The people that give us the money and invest in us, the insurance companies, and our employees. So the people who work for us, particularly young people, will come in and say, what are you doing about climate change? I don't want to in any way be involved in the fossil fuel industry. So employee, you have a role to play as an employee. And exactly, you have a role to play and to ask these questions within the context of your work and your profession. The other thing that I'm working really closely with is a lot of organisations that are based around sport and activities like surfing, and how parents parents and aficionados of those sports want those sports to continue. Now, they're not going to be able to continue in 40-degree heat with bushfires. So there are ways you can get involved. And I think small, manageable steps are important. You don't have to change your life. You can even begin to have just a conversation with some of your friends. Suggest a book about climate change at your book club. I mean, not just, you could get my book, or you could get any other one. There's a lot of also really interesting novels written about what the world is going to be like in the future. So there are so many opportunities, but for me, it's always start small and start within the context of your own life. I would hate to say to people, you've got to turn your life upside down to do something about climate change. Most of us either can't do it or don't. It's too high price to pay. So that's what I'd say. Start having some conversations in your friendship networks. ask some serious questions at work about what their commitment to climate change, because it actually does matter. It matters, and it's changed the practices of some of these massive corporations that are now putting a lot of pressure on governments to change as well. I mean, when Macquarie Bank, IKEA and Woolworths are all saying we're headed down the renewable energy path, it can be really, really difficult for governments to ignore when there's that level of consensus at the business community end.
I guess what you're saying is really make a commitment to yourself that this is important, and in whatever way you're going to find a way to use your voice, use your networks, just to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that happens as well, this would be very small. I know it's voting on climate change is a big ask for most people. But one thing that politicians will always say to me, a lot of them will always say is, oh, except for the environment movement, I never hear from my constituents about climate change. Never. And I don't know whether they're just lying to me or not. Sometimes just literally sending an email, a personal and not, blank, form email saying, I live in your electorate, this is who I am. I'm actually really worried about climate change. I'm worried about it. I see what it's doing in my electorate. I'm worried for my kids. What is it you and your party doing about this? And try and make it authentic. And sometimes that's all you need. If we had 4 or 5 of those every day coming through in every electorate, genuine ones, not organised by the climate movement. Again, don't underestimate what that means, particularly if you're in a marginal seat. It just forces politicians to start to think and start to ask questions. And all of this change is small and incremental, but it has to be, because we're asking, what we're trying to do is quite significant.
What a great tip. Can you imagine, even as senior citizens, demographics all the way through, just saying, we're going to do something this month about, and all of a sudden the politicians getting, oh, okay, we really need to move this along.
That's exactly right. When they start seeing people in their electorate raise this spontaneously with them and organically, rather than necessarily through a kind of form letter or petition, they start to think, oh, this is something that people have on their minds. And to tell you the truth, there are quite a lot of, there's a lot of criticism of the federal government on climate change. There are changes happening within the federal Liberal Party, and there are lots of terrific members of Parliament on the Conservative side that are doing what they can and would like to see changes in this area, because they see the economic benefits to Australia, the immediate economic benefits. And so even if you are a Conservative voter in a Conservative seat but worried about climate change, a simple email to your local member is not water off a duck's back, if that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, good tip. So any activist, and we work with a lot, and whilst you're a social researcher, I do regard you as an activist, because I am now.
That's again how I see myself. No Birkenstock still though, all high heels.
So how do you manage your own self-care? Because burnout's a real problem around for activists. It's so focused, it's so demanding, and you've got to take time out.
Yeah, so self-care, I find that I have to reset every 6 months, and it's so easy to just then start to fall in a pattern of endless work and looking after kids, because that's a really important part of it. So every 6 months I go through a thing where I just try and pull things down. So my 3 important acts of self-care are hiking. Like, even though I don't like Birkenstocks, I do like hiking, although I do not camp.
No, do I.
The closest I get to is glamping, but I do love hiking, and I love hiking in the Australian wilderness, because I want to kind of see what's at stake, and I do love that. So I've done lots of hikes in Tasmania, and I've got about 25 different walks that I want to do in Australia, so I'm trying to do one of those every year. I have a wonderful, fabulous group of friends, and we do we're at that point in our lives in our late 70s, late 50s, sorry, late 40s, sorry, I'm 48, gosh. Where we're all either where our kids are grown up or they're grown up enough to be left at home with babysitters pretty easily, and we've got a bit of energy. So I have a wonderful network of friends. So hiking, friends, and cooking. I love to cook. So I do spend a lot of time cooking as a kind of but I find the self-care part of it really difficult. But I think the thing that activists, the mistake that activists make, and one of the good things about coming to activism later in your life, is you realise you can't solve every problem, that it's not all on you. So I don't see, here's the problem of climate change, I've got to solve it. I think this is what I'm good at doing. I'm a good researcher and a good communicator. So that is my contribution. That's my gift. So that's my contribution. And all I focus on is, am I making within my small role and skills the best contribution to this larger problem? And so I kind of am very modest in my so I don't think about the broader problems of, like, all the problems of climate change and feeling like I need to address them. I just think about, am I contributing my best effort to this, which is one tiny effort in the millions of other people doing that work.
Absolutely. And I guess the last question, which I ask everyone, and you'll find really fascinating, that in all these conversations, when I ask, what does spirituality mean to you, just about everyone has said being connected to nature or something higher than myself. Just about everyone. So I guess I'm asking you the same question. I don't think I'm going to be surprised with the answer.
Well, it's a bit, so I grew up in the Catholic Church. My mother taught religious education in Catholic schools her whole life, and her partner was a Christian brother. And I spent almost all of my childhood in and around churches. I got to go to Mass with the Pope one year. And I grew up around church history and around nuns particularly. And so I always had a real interest and respect. You know, there's lots of challenges with the Catholic Church, there's no doubt about it. But of the nuns, and particularly of the nuns that I met, just this commitment to social justice. And so I grew up with that, which I think absolutely informed my politics more than anything else. And then what that has meant for me as well, having grown up around churches, is that when something really difficult happens or bad happens in my life, or my grandmother died, all I wanted to do is go to Mass in the church that she went to up in. I just wanted to be in a quiet, entirely a space dedicated to reflection. We don't really have, except for natural spaces, not many places in our lives where that's the case. We have, everything is either busy or loud or full of technology, or and so really churches and nature are pretty much the only places that I can go to be, that are genuinely non-commercial, publicly available spaces that are quiet and invite reflection. So for me, spirituality is a sense of a larger obligation you have, a larger obligation you have to the people around you, the world around you, the generations that have come before you, and the generations that you hope will thrive in the future. It's a sense of deep connectedness to other people. And there is a kind of, at its best, when it's working at its best, being involved in the environmental movement and the climate movement is that. It is a whole lot of people that are thinking, I'm doing something now that will pay dividends later down the track when I'm not going to be around, where and I think that kind of sense of higher purpose and meaning to the work that you do is kind of extends out of that sense of spirituality as well.
Thanks for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you.